every single day, your city, and, well, practically every city on Earth, really spends thousands, sometimes millions of taxpayer dollars to actively destroy what is essentially a massive hidden gold mine.
Yeah, a literal gold mine.
Right, and I am talking about the municipal sewer system and the trucks that haul away our food waste. Because when you look at a city's infrastructure budget, there's always this entire massive category dedicated to wastewater treatment and organic waste management.
Oh, absolutely.
And almost universally, it's just treated as a black hole. It's a liability. You put money in just to get rid of the problem. And I mean, the best case scenario is that the local river doesn't get contaminated.
Yeah, it's the ultimate sunk cost. The traditional engineering mindset, it looks at municipal sludge or food scraps and sees only a biohazard, something that just has to be neutralized.
Right.
It's this very binary ledger. We have dirty water, so we need to spend massive amounts of energy and harsh chemicals to make it clean water, and the organic solids left over, just bury them in a landfill. Or burn them. Which is financially agonizing when you realize what's actually in that sludge. So welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
If you are, say, a city planner prepping for a council meeting, or maybe an investor evaluating sustainable infrastructure, or honestly just insanely curious about the hidden mechanics of how our cities actually operate, you are in the right place. Today, we are unpacking a really specific, highly granular document. It's the May 2026 Circular Bioeconomy Investment Proposal, authored by Jory Miller.
And this document is fascinating because, well, it's not an academic thought experiment.
Right, it's actionable.
Exactly. It's a bankable blueprint. It's designed to look at that exact municipal waste stream you mentioned and completely rewrite the ledger. The entire goal here is to take wastewater sludge and organic bioscraps and just transform them into a multi-million-dollar revenue engine.
And we're going to explore the entire closed-loop system they designed to actually do this. So we'll look at how they turn human waste into pipeline-quality renewable natural gas, how they use toxic wastewater to grow agricultural fertilizer, and the choice municipalities face between producing that fertilizer or upgrading to liquid biodiesel.
But we also really need to dissect the brutal economic realities here, too.
Oh, for sure. The spreadsheets.
Right. We are going to look at the massive upfront capital costs, the return on investment, and critically, the specific government credit markets that completely dictate whether these projects succeed or just become, abandoned, really expensive science fairs.
Yeah.
Because the central thesis we're working with here is the concept of the circular bioeconomy. It argues that municipal waste is just a stranded asset. It's packed with recoverable energy, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus.
Okay, so let's unpack this from the ground up. Because to mine those assets, the facility needs an engine. And the proposal bases its entire operation around a biological core called anaerobic digestion, or AD. Now, I know anaerobic just means without oxygen, but walk me through the actual mechanics here. Like, what happens when a city diverts its sludge into one of these massive industrial tanks?
Well, it's essentially a microscopic war zone.
A war zone.
Yeah, but a highly choreographed one. You take the primary feedstocks, so municipal wastewater sludge, maybe local food waste from restaurants or grocery stores, and you pump it into this massive, completely sealed, oxygen-free reactor. And inside that tank, you have a very specific, multi-layered community of microorganisms.
Okay.
And they break down the waste in 4 distinct biological stages.
4 stages. See, I always pictured it just as like a giant vat of bacteria eating the sludge and burping out gas.
No, it's much more complex than that, which is exactly why these systems can be so incredibly temperamental. So the first stage is hydrolysis. The organic waste is full of large, complex polymers, right? Proteins, carbohydrates, fats.
Right, the big stuff.
Yeah. So the first wave of bacteria breaks those large chains down into much simpler sugars and amino acids. Then in the second stage, which is acidogenesis, a completely different set of bacteria ferments those simple sugars into volatile fatty acids.
Volatile fatty acids, I mean, that sounds highly corrosive.
It is. It changes the pH of the tank significantly, which then leads directly into the third stage, acetogenesis, where those acids are converted into acetic acid, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen.
Okay, so we're building up to the gas.
Exactly. Finally, we reach the fourth stage, methanogenesis. And this is where the actual magic happens. A very specialized group of microorganisms, they're called methanogens, they consume the acetic acid and hydrogen, and they produce biogas.
And biogas is the actual prize we're after here.
It is. Biogas is primarily a mixture of methane and carbon dioxide. The methane is the energy carrier. But, to make this entire four-stage biological ballet actually work at a profitable municipal scale, the proposal dictates a very specific baseline. The medium municipal design uses 10 tons of dry matter per day.
Wait, I need to pause you on the phrase dry matter. Because anyone who has even thought about a sewer knows that municipal sludge is definitely not dry. It's mostly just water.
Yes, and that is exactly the distinction we need to make here. The proposal specifies operating the digester at a 10% total solids concentration.
Okay, meaning 90% of what's in the tank is water.
Exactly. So to process 10 tons of actual dry organic material, the facility has to manage a slurry mass of 100 tons every single day.
Wow.
Just imagine moving 100 tons of thick, dark, wet slurry through these tanks constantly.
That is a staggering logistical footprint. But looking at the text here, the proposal breaks down that 10 tons of dry matter even further. And here's where it gets really interesting to me. You can't just pump 10 tons of pure sewage sludge and food waste into the tank. The mix is actually 8 tons of the primary waste and 2 tons of a microbial inoculum.
Right. The inoculum is absolutely critical. It's essentially a massive starter culture.
Like sourdough.
Exactly like sourdough or kombucha. You need a robust, pre-existing colony of bacteria to ensure those 4 biological stages we just talked about don't just crash.
But even with that starter culture, the proposal highlights this massive biological bottleneck. And from what I understand, this is something that derailed a lot of those early waste-to-energy projects back in the 2000s. You can't just feed the digester an endless diet of pure sewage and food waste because it throws out the chemistry.
Yeah, the main issue there is nitrogen. Sewage sludge and food scraps, especially meats and proteins from food waste, they are incredibly nitrogen-rich. In anaerobic digestion, the microorganisms need a very specific ratio of carbon to nitrogen in their diet. We call it the C to N ratio.
See, I like to explain this using the human digestive system.
Yeah, go for it.
Think of the digester as like a high-performance bodybuilder's stomach. If that bodybuilder decides to only consume pure, isolated whey protein powder all day long, which is highly concentrated nitrogen, they're going to get violently ill.
Yeah, they really are.
The human digestive system would just seize up. It needs a massive dose of complex carbohydrates, of fiber, to basically balance out that protein, extract the energy, and keep the system moving smoothly.
That analogy actually holds up perfectly on a chemical level. So for these methanogen microbes, the ideal carbon to nitrogen ratio is roughly 30 to 1. So 30 parts carbon for every 1 part nitrogen. If you feed them a diet of mostly sewage sludge, which might have a ratio of maybe 10 to 1 or even lower, the bacteria break down that excess nitrogen and they convert it into ammonia.
And ammonia is essentially bleach. I mean, it's a harsh cleaning chemical.
It is highly toxic. So in a closed tank, the ammonia concentration just spikes. It literally poisons the methanogens.
The exact bacteria you need.
Right, the very bacteria you're relying on to produce the methane gas. This is called ammonia inhibition. The bacteria die off, the gas production plummets, and your multi-million-dollar digester just becomes a stagnant, foul-smelling vat of dead sludge.
So the bodybuilder has severe stomach cramps, and the facility loses millions of dollars. Great. So how does the Jory-Miller proposal solve the nitrogen overdose? Where do they get the massive amounts of carbon fiber needed to balance out all that municipal sludge?
They look directly to the local ecosystem. The proposal integrates the harvesting of broadleaf cattails. The scientific name is Typha latifolia.
Wait, cattails. As in the tall, fuzzy swamp grass you see growing in the ditches on the side of the highway.
The very same ones. Cattails are an incredibly robust, fast-growing wetland plant. But more importantly for us, they are packed with tough, carbon-rich structural material. They are basically the perfect high-carbon fiber to balance the high-nitrogen protein of the sewage sludge.
But cattails are notoriously tough. I mean, you can't just chew on a cattail. The plant fibers are incredibly resilient. How do microscopic bacteria in a tank break down swamp grass?
Well, the resilience of the cattail comes from something called lignocellulosic carbon. Lignin is essentially a complex organic polymer, right? It acts like a structural glue. And then the cellulose provides the rigid fibers.
Okay, so they work together.
Yeah, together they form this armor that allows the plant to stand upright in a marsh. And it's very hard to break down. That is exactly why the proposal pairs the cattails with a very specific type of microbial inoculum. They don't just use standard bacteria. They use rumen fluid.
Rumen fluid, meaning fluid from the rumen, which is the first stomach of a cow.
Yes. Because cows have evolved over millions of years to do one specific thing incredibly well, which is digest tough lignocellulosic grasses. Their stomach fluid is just teeming with specialized enzymes and bacteria designed to break down that plant armor.
Wow.
So by adding rumen fluid to the digester, along with the cattails and the sludge, you completely supercharge the hydrolysis stage.
That is just wild. We are essentially building a mechanical 100-ton per day cow stomach to digest our city's waste.
Yeah.
And looking at the numbers here, the math on this is staggering. The proposal cites research showing that if you successfully co-digest sewage sludge with cattails and use that rumen fluid, you can boost the specific biogas yield by up to 50%.
A 50% increase in energy production simply by balancing the diet of the microbes. I mean, it completely transforms the economics of this facility.
I am going to push back here, though,
Sure.
because I understand the chemistry. The carbon balances the nitrogen. That makes
Yeah.
perfect sense. But practically speaking, this is a municipal facility. It has to run 365 days a year.
Yeah.
Cattails are seasonal plants. They sprout in the spring, they grow in the summer, and they die and completely freeze over in the winter. So if your entire multi-million-dollar energy operation relies on balancing the sludge with cattails, what does the city do in January when the marsh is buried under 2 feet of snow?
That's a great question, and it's the glaring vulnerability of almost all plant-based biofuel systems.
Yeah.
But it's also where the engineering rigor of this proposal really becomes apparent. The facility operates on a stockpiling strategy.
Oh, they save them up.
Right, they don't just harvest what they need for the day. During the peak summer growing months, they actively harvest massive amounts of cattail biomass. Then they use a low-energy passive solar drying system, which I know we'll detail extensively later on, to remove the moisture and preserve the plant material.
So they are literally making hay while the sun shines. They dry it and store it in huge warehouses. So the digester has this constant, mathematically perfect diet of carbon all winter long.
Precisely. Now, to be totally realistic, the financial modeling in the proposal does not assume they will achieve that theoretical 50% boost every single day.
Right. Things go wrong.
There are inevitable losses. Biomass degrades slightly while it's in storage, some is lost during the harvesting and transport, and the solar drying process isn't completely perfect, so the proposal uses a much more conservative 40% captured production uplift in its target ROI model.
But even at that more conservative 40% mark, the math works. The proposal estimates that the year-round cattail enhancement generates an estimated $520,000 in net annual benefit for the facility.
Yeah.
Just $500,000 a year, basically just by adding dried swamp grass to the sewage.
And that value is derived from the final product of the digester. The raw biogas, that mix of methane and CO2 we talked about, it's captured, scrubbed of impurities like hydrogen sulfide, and then it's upgraded.
Yeah.
The carbon dioxide is separated out until you're left with a gas that is greater than 97% pure methane.
Which is renewable natural gas, or RNG, pipeline quality. So it's molecularly identical to the fossil fuel natural gas that heats our homes and our stoves, but it was generated completely above ground from our own waste.
Exactly. That RNG is injected directly into the existing municipal utility grid. It is the primary financial anchor of the entire project. But, the gas is really only half the story here.
Right. And this brings us to the massive, highly visible problem that we need to solve next. We put 100 tons of wet slurry into this tank every day. The bacteria ate the carbon and burped out the methane gas, but the water didn't go anywhere.
Right.
The inorganic minerals didn't go anywhere. So coming out the back end of this digester, you have roughly 100 tons of liquid digestate every single day.
And this liquid digestate is notoriously difficult to handle. I mean, it's dark, it has really high levels of suspended solids, and crucially, it is packed with incredibly concentrated nutrients. All of that nitrogen and phosphorus from the food waste and sludge that didn't get converted into gas is now just suspended in this liquid.
And in a traditional wastewater mindset, this digestate is a toxic liability, because if a city simply dumped that liquid into a local river, it would trigger an absolute ecological disaster.
It causes a phenomenon called eutrophication. The massive influx of nitrogen and phosphorus acts as like a hyper-fertilizer for naturally occurring algae in the river.
Oh, right, the blooms.
Yeah, the algae bloom exponentially, just completely covering the surface of the water. And when that massive algae bloom eventually dies, the bacteria that decompose the dead algae consume all the dissolved oxygen in the water.
Which creates a hypoxic dead zone. The fish suffocate, the ecosystem collapses, and the city gets hit with massive environmental fines. So traditionally, cities spend millions of dollars on these energy-intensive aeration tanks and harsh chemical treatments just to strip those nutrients out of the water before it leaves the plant.
Which is completely treating the symptom, not the underlying value. The Miller proposal flips this dynamic entirely, because if the nitrogen and phosphorus in the digestate naturally want to grow massive amounts of algae, well, why not let them? But just do it in a highly controlled, engineered environment.
And this is where we get into the algae-cattail biological treatment ponds. So tell me how they're actually monetizing this toxic liquid.
The facility routes the liquid digestate into a series of shallow, engineered ponds. These ponds are intentionally seeded with specific strains of microalgae. The algae act as a biological filter. They literally feed on the nitrogen and phosphorus in the digestate, using photosynthesis from the sun to convert those nutrients into cellular mass.
So the algae are essentially performing the wastewater treatment for free.
They are. The proposal provides the exact biological metrics from a recent meta-analysis, and it shows that 1 metric ton of dry algal biomass will naturally remove approximately 64 kilograms of ammonia nitrogen and 7.3 kilograms of phosphorus from the wastewater.
And they don't stop with just the microalgae either. The proposal also calls for planting cattails, the exact same plants we are harvesting for the digester, directly into these treatment ponds.
Right, because the cattails provide what we call secondary polishing. While the microscopic algae are floating in the water column eating the dissolved nutrients, the massive root systems of the cattails slow down the movement of the water.
Okay, acting like a physical barrier.
Yeah, and this allows the heavier suspended solids to just settle out. Furthermore, cattail roots are excellent at absorbing heavy metals and trace contaminants that the algae might just miss entirely. So it creates this robust, multi-layered biological filtration system.
Okay, I understand the biology, but let's talk about the civil engineering and the politics of actually building this. Because there's a very specific requirement in the proposal that really caught my eye. The proposal strictly mandates that these ponds must be built with engineered clay or composite plastic liners.
That is a critical detail for anyone evaluating this as a public infrastructure project.
And here is why I bring it up. I have read research, and there are some vocal sustainability advocates who push this pretty hard, arguing that unlined ponds are vastly superior.
Right, the bioclogging argument.
Yes, they say that if you just dig a massive hole in the dirt and fill it with wastewater, the pond will eventually seal itself. The organic matter, the dead bacteria, the sludgy solids, they all get pushed into the pores of the soil and create this impermeable barrier, bioclogging. And they argue that bioclogging saves millions of dollars in upfront capital because you don't have to buy acres of expensive high-density polyethylene plastic or haul in tons of specialized bentonite clay. So why is this proposal insisting on spending so much money on artificial liners?
Well, the advocates of unlined ponds are scientifically correct about bioclogging. It is a documented phenomenon. I mean, in agricultural settings like dairy manure lagoons, the soil often does eventually seal itself. But eventually is a terrifying word when you are dealing with municipal wastewater.
Right, because what exactly is happening while you wait for the bioclogging to finish?
You are actively leaching highly concentrated ammonia-rich liquid digestate straight down into the groundwater aquifer. And when you are proposing a multi-million-dollar public works project, you have to survive environmental impact reviews, state regulators, and public city council hearings.
Oh, man. Imagine standing in front of a city council, looking the mayor in the eye, and saying, don't worry, the toxic sludge will eventually plug the dirt hole we dug directly above the town's drinking water supply.
You would be laughed out of the room, and the project would be dead on arrival. The permitting risk of an unlined pond is simply astronomical in a municipal context. The engineered clay or composite liner is an insurance policy. Yes, it requires more capital upfront, but it guarantees absolute groundwater protection from day one. It basically transforms the project from an interesting ecological experiment into bankable, approvable public infrastructure.
That makes perfect sense. It's just the cost of doing business in the real world.
Yeah.
But I have another really practical question about these ponds. We are pumping raw digestate into them. And we already established that digestate is dark, sludgy, and full of ammonia.
Right.
Algae are plants. They need sunlight to photosynthesize.
Yeah.
If the water is black, the light can't penetrate. And furthermore, didn't we just establish that ammonia is toxic to bacteria?
Hmm.
Isn't it toxic to algae too? If you pump dark ammonia water into a pond, don't you just kill the algae you were trying to grow?
You've identified the exact mechanism that caused so many first-generation algal wastewater treatment facilities to just fail completely. They would build these massive ponds, pump in the digestate, and the algae would immediately die from ammonia toxicity and light starvation.
So what was the industry workaround back then?
The historical workaround was incredibly brute force, honestly. It was dilution. Facility operators would take 1 part of the dark digestate and mix it with 50 or even 100 parts of clean, fresh water. Yeah, they diluted the mixture until it was transparent enough for sunlight to penetrate and weak enough that the ammonia didn't kill the algae.
Which is completely insane. The entire point of the facility is to sustainably treat wastewater. If you have to drain the local municipal reservoir of millions of gallons of pristine drinking water just to dilute your waste, you have defeated the entire environmental purpose of the project.
It completely ruins the water footprint. And it ruins the energy footprint, too, because now you have to pump 100 times more water through your system. The Jory-Miller proposal explicitly rejects the dilution method. Instead, it relies on advanced biological and chemical pretreatment of the digestate before it is ever introduced to the algae ponds.
Okay, so how does pretreatment solve the light and the ammonia problem?
First, they run the digestate through a process called controlled nitrification. This utilizes a completely different set of bacteria that specifically consume the harsh, toxic ammonia and convert it into nitrate. Nitrate is much less toxic and actually serves as an incredibly bioavailable food source for the algae. And second, they use mild chemical flocculation or mechanical settling to drop the darkest, heaviest suspended solids out of the liquid.
So by the time the liquid actually hits the pond, the toxic ammonia has been transformed into this all-you-can-eat nitrate buffet, and the water has been clarified just enough to let the sun shine through.
Exactly. The algae can thrive in high-strength wastewater without the need for a single drop of freshwater dilution.
Okay, so we have successfully grown massive, vibrant green blooms of algae in our lined ponds. They are eating the nutrients, the water is getting cleaner, but growing algae is really only half the battle. If you look at the history of the biotech sector over the last 20 years, growing algae is actually the easy part.
It is. The industry is essentially a graveyard of venture-backed startups that could grow algae beautifully in open ponds, but they just went bankrupt trying to harvest it.
Let's talk about the water weight problem. How does this proposal actually get the algae out of the pond without destroying the economics of the entire facility?
Well, to understand the brilliance of the solution here, we really have to quantify the historical problem. Algae grow in what engineers call very dilute suspensions. So even when you look at a pond that is a thick, dark, vibrant green, the actual dry, solid mass of the algae cells is incredibly small. It typically represents between 0.02% and 0.05% of the total volume of the pond.
Meaning that 99.9% of that green soup is just plain water.
Yes. So if you want to harvest 1 single ton of actual algae biomass, you have to physically move, process, and separate thousands of tons of water. And traditionally, companies approached this with heavy industrial machinery. They would use massive pumps to suck up the pond water, run it through gigantic, power-hungry centrifuges to spin the heavy algae cells out of the liquid, and then they dump that wet algae paste into fossil fuel-powered thermal dryers to evaporate the rest of the moisture.
Which requires an unbelievable amount of electricity and natural gas. I actually read a metric in the source data about the energy return on investment, or ERI, for those traditional methods.
Oh, yeah. The EROI for traditional algae harvesting is often less than 1.
Which is the definition of a thermodynamic dead end. It means you are burning more energy to run the pumps, the centrifuges, and the thermal dryers than you actually get back from the energy contained within the dried algae itself. You are quite literally burning money.
It is economically impossible to scale. So the Jory-Miller proposal attacks this problem with 2 specific innovations. The first is a sensor-based harvesting system, and the second is a low-energy solar kiln. Let's start with the sensors.
How are they doing it before sensors, though? Just guessing.
Essentially, yes. Historically, facility operators used fixed timer harvesting. They would say, okay, every Tuesday and Friday, we turn on the massive pumps and drain half the pond. But biological growth is not linear. Algae reproduction depends on sunlight intensity, cloud cover, ambient temperature, and nutrient flow.
So if you harvest on a strict schedule, you are completely ignoring the reality of the biology in the pond.
Exactly. If you harvest too early on a Tuesday, the algae haven't multiplied enough, and you end up pumping mostly just water through your very expensive centrifuge. If you wait too long, the algae overpopulate. The bloom becomes so dense that the algae at the top block the sunlight from reaching the algae at the bottom.
Oh, and then they die.
Right, the algae at the bottom die, they decompose, they consume the oxygen, and the entire pond experiences a catastrophic bloom crash. You just lose the whole crop.
It's like clear-cutting a forest on a rigid calendar schedule without ever bothering to walk out into the woods to see if the trees have actually grown back.
That is a very apt comparison.
Yeah.
To prevent this, the proposal replaces the timer with an array of real-time sensors submerged directly in the treatment ponds. These sensors are constantly monitoring a really complex matrix of data points. They track turbidity, which is the cloudiness of the water, dissolved oxygen, pH levels, water temperature, and critically, chlorophyll A concentrations and light penetration depth.
So the computer knows the exact biological state of the pond at any given second.
Yes. This system calculates the exact moment the algae density hits the absolute perfect sweet spot for harvesting. But even then, they don't turn on a massive pump and drain the pond.
Because that would be clear-cutting the forest.
Right, because algae needs sunlight. The densest, most mature algae naturally stratify and float near the surface of the pond. So the facility uses an automated mechanical skimmer. It acts like a highly precise razor, gliding across the top of the water and only removing the optimal top layer of thick biomass.
So instead of clear-cutting the forest, they're basically just giving the pond a very precise haircut.
I love that, yes. And that haircut accomplishes two vital things simultaneously. First, because you are only skimming the densest layer, you drastically reduce the sheer volume of water you have to send to the centrifuge. You're pumping a much thicker slurry, which saves a massive amount of electricity. And second, you leave the vast majority of the pond completely intact. The remaining algae are healthy, they suddenly have improved light penetration because you remove the top canopy, and they stay in a continuous active growth phase. You completely eliminate the risk of a boom and bust bloom crash.
Okay, I am tracking with the liquid side. The sensors and the skimmer mean we are doing much less work to get a thicker paste out of the centrifuge. But we still have a wet algae paste. It is still heavy, it is still wet, and we still have to dry it. And you just told me that firing up an industrial thermal dryer ruins the energy return on investment. So how do we dry it without going broke?
We step away from fossil fuels entirely and utilize the solar kiln. After the centrifuge, the wet algae paste, and we should note here, the harvested cattails we discussed earlier go through this exact same process. The biomass is spread into thin layers on specialized drying trays, and these trays are then loaded into a modified 40-foot Connex-style shipping container.
Okay, I am going to be the skeptical city council member here for a second.
Bring it on!
A shipping container. Are you telling me that a metal box with some glass on the roof is supposed to replace a multi-million-dollar industrial-grade thermal dryer? I mean, it sounds incredibly low-tech for a facility that is supposed to be a state-of-the-art biorefinery.
It is lower tech, but that is the genius of the engineering. In a circular bioeconomy, the goal is not maximum speed, the goal is maximum margin. An industrial dryer can dry algae in minutes, sure, but it destroys your profit margin.
Because of the gas bill.
Exactly. The solar kiln might take days, but the energy is free. And the engineering of this specific kiln is actually quite sophisticated. It features dual-layer polycarbonate glazing, much like a high-end commercial greenhouse, to trap shortwave solar radiation. And it uses polished internal reflectors to concentrate the sunlight directly onto the trays.
But the sun goes down. An industrial dryer runs 247. Does the drying process just stop completely at 6 p.m. every night?
Not with this design, because it incorporates a thermal mass system using an erythritol phase change material, or PCM.
Erythritol phase change material.
Okay.
Okay, you have to break that down for me. What is actually happening there?
Think about how an ice cube works, but in reverse. When water freezes into ice, it releases heat. When ice melts into water, it absorbs heat. That transition from a solid to a liquid is called a phase change, and it requires a massive amount of latent thermal energy.
Okay, so how does that apply to the kiln?
Well, erythritol is a naturally occurring sugar alcohol, and it has a very specific melting point. During the peak hours of the day, when the sun is blazing and the kiln is getting excessively hot, the erythritol panels absorb that excess solar heat, and they literally melt from a solid into a liquid. They act like a thermal battery, storing the heat.
So it prevents the kiln from literally baking and destroying the algae during the day.
Exactly. Then, when the sun sets and the ambient air temperature drops, the liquid erythritol begins to slowly solidify back into a crystal. As it undergoes that phase change back to a solid, it slowly releases all of that stored thermal energy back into the air inside the kiln.
So the sugar alcohol basically acts like a radiator, keeping the kiln hot all night long.
It allows the container to maintain high drying temperatures, often between 80 and 150 degrees Celsius, long after the sun has set. It ensures continuous 24-hour drying without burning a single cubic foot of natural gas. Now, to be fully transparent, solar drying does not eliminate all operating costs.
Right, there's still upkeep.
Yeah, the facility still has to pay for the labor to physically move the trays in and out, the maintenance of the ventilation fans, and the depreciation of the equipment itself. But it absolutely annihilates the purchased energy costs.
Which was the single biggest killer of algae economics. By solving the water weight problem with sensors and solar power, the proposal has successfully de-risked the most dangerous part of the operation. And there's a strategic secondary benefit to drying the algae this way, right? They don't have to decide what to do with the algae until after it's dried.
That is a crucial point of flexibility. In a traditional facility, the wet slurry might be piped directly into a chemical reactor. But here, once the algae is safely and cheaply dried into a stable powder, the facility basically hits the pause button. They run rigorous lab analytics on the dried biomass.
What exactly are they testing for?
They test the lipid content, which is the natural fat necessary to make biodiesel. They test the NPK values, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, to grade its value as a fertilizer. They look at the micronutrient profile. And critically, because this algae was grown in municipal wastewater, they absolutely have to test for heavy metals or pathogens that might have carried over from the sewage sludge.
I just love this approach. It's like looking at the menu after you've already cooked the food. They look at the objective lab data from that week's harvest and ask, okay, based on the actual chemical makeup of this specific batch, what is the most profitable market we can sell this into today? It completely insulates the city from biological risk. If the algae didn't produce enough fat this week, no problem. We just sell it as fertilizer.
It provides absolute operational agility. And this brings us to the major decision point of the proposal. The facility is fully operational. The digester is producing clean, renewable natural gas. The cattails are stockpiled. The toxic digestate is treating itself in the ponds. The algae is being skimmed by sensors and dried by the sun. Now, the city council and the investors have to make a choice regarding the final capital build-out. Do they authorize Proposal 1 or Proposal 2?
Let's dive into Proposal 1 first. This is the lower-risk fertilizer and biostimulant pathway. Walk me through the strategy here. What happens to our shipping container full of dried, tested algae powder?
In Proposal 1, the dried algae is absolutely not used for fuel. It is strictly an agricultural product. Assuming it passes all those rigorous safety tests for heavy metals and pathogens, the biomass is sold directly into the agricultural sector.
Okay.
Depending on the specific nutrient profile of the batch, it can be sold as a bulk organic biofertilizer, it can be sold as a raw feedstock to companies that blend custom fertilizers, or if the amino acid profile is exceptionally high, it can be marketed as a premium biostimulant.
A biostimulant meaning it doesn't just feed the plant. It actually helps the plant's roots absorb native nutrients more efficiently, right?
Exactly. It's a high-value agricultural amendment.
So Proposal 1 is pretty straightforward. Grow the algae, dry it cheaply, test it for safety, and sell it to farmers. Now, let's look at the financial modeling for this pathway, because these numbers are where things get truly staggering. The planning-level capital cost to build this entire facility, so the 100-ton digester, the massive gas upgrading equipment, the lined ponds, the sensors, the solar kilns, the total price tag is estimated at $8.46 million.
Correct. And to break that down slightly, the lion's share of that capital, roughly $4.96 million, is dedicated solely to the RNG upgrading equipment and the grid interconnection. The remaining $3.5 million covers the biological side, the digester tanks, the ponds, the clay liners, the kilns, and the winter recovery systems.
Okay, $8.46 million to build it. And the model projects an annual net cash flow of $2.995 million, which leads us to the return on investment metrics. The proposal calculates a 2.82-year simple payback period and a 15-year simple ROI of 431%.
Yeah, the numbers are highly aggressive.
I really want to contextualize this for you listening, because if you are a city planner, a 2.8-year payback on a public works project is almost incomprehensible. When a city builds a new water treatment plant or a bridge, they usually finance it with 30-year municipal bonds. They expect it to take 3 decades to pay off. To have an $8 million wastewater facility pay for itself in under 36 months, I have to ask, what is the catch? Is the entire financial model resting on some unproven magical market for premium algae biostimulants?
It's vital to scrutinize the revenue streams here because you're right, the bottom line does look almost too good to be true at first glance. But the catch is actually not the algae. While the agricultural market for algae fertilizer is robust and growing, the algae is just a drop in the bucket financially. Out of that roughly $3 million in annual cash flow, the algae fertilizer sales only account for $200,000.
Okay, so the algae is really just the icing on the cake.
Mhm.
Let's break down the rest of that $3 million pie.
Yeah.
Where is the real money actually coming from?
Let's add it up. We have $200,000 from the algae fertilizer. We already mentioned the $520,000 net benefit from the cattail enhanced biogas. That's the extra methane generated by balancing the digester's diet with the swamp grass.
Right.
And then we have $225,000 generated from winter recovered NPK fertilizer.
Oh, wait, I need to pause you there because we haven't discussed the winter operations in depth yet. We talked about stockpiling the dried cattails, so the digester has a carbon food source in January. But what happens to the liquid digestate? Because the algae ponds are exposed to the elements. During the winter, the algae are largely dormant, the cattails in the pond have died back, and the water might even freeze over. But the city doesn't stop flushing its toilets just because it's snowing.
Right. The sludge keeps coming.
Exactly. So what do they do with the toxic digestate when the biological ponds are completely offline?
It is a critical operational pivot. During the cold months, the facility bypasses the biological ponds entirely. The liquid digestate is routed instead through an indoor chemical precipitation process. Specifically, the facility utilizes the addition of magnesium chloride and a zeolite ion exchange system.
Zeolite ion exchange. Okay, break down the chemistry for me. How does that pull the nitrogen and phosphorus out of freezing wastewater?
Let's start with the zeolite. Zeolites are fascinating, naturally occurring microporous minerals. On a microscopic level, they have a highly rigid, honeycomb-like crystalline structure. And that structure carries a negative electromagnetic charge. When you pump the ammonia-rich digestate through a bed of zeolite crystals, the positively charged ammonium ions are physically drawn into the honeycomb structure.
Like a magnet.
Yeah, and they swap places with sodium or calcium ions that were already in the zeolite. It acts like a highly specific molecular sponge that only soaks up nitrogen.
That handles the nitrogen. What about the phosphorus?
That is where the magnesium chloride comes in. When you introduce magnesium to wastewater that is rich in ammonium and phosphate, it triggers a chemical precipitation reaction. The dissolved molecules bind together and literally fall out of the liquid as a solid white crystalline mineral called struvite.
So instead of growing green algae to eat the nutrients, you are using molecular sponges and chemical reactions to basically force the nutrients to crystallize into solid rocks.
Precisely. And struvite is an incredibly valuable slow-release NPK fertilizer. The proposal notes that this winter process recovers more than 99% of the phosphorus and 85 to 92% of the nitrogen from the liquid, turning it into a dry, highly marketable mineral commodity. That is where that $225,000 in winter revenue comes from.
Okay, let's tally up the revenue again. We have $200,000 from the summer algae. We have $225,000 from the winter struvite crystals. We have $520,000 from the cattail methane boost. That is roughly $945,000. But you said the annual cash flow is almost $3 million. Where is the remaining $2 million coming from? What is the actual engine driving this 2.8-year payback?
The anchor. The absolute financial bedrock of this entire $8.46 million facility is the $2.05 million generated annually by the renewable natural gas. And this is the real cash you were looking for earlier. That $2.05 million does not come from simply selling the gas on the open commodity market. It is entirely dependent on securing government-backed renewable identification number credits, or RINs.
RINs. Yeah. The government policy mechanism.
Yes. Without RN credits, the physical methane gas simply does not sell for enough money to justify the massive capital expense of the upgrading equipment. The highly profitable model of Proposal 1 relies completely on navigating that regulatory framework. We'll dive into the specific existential risks of the RIN market in a moment, but for now, the takeaway is that Proposal 1 is fundamentally an RNG energy facility. It uses algae and chemical precipitation to handle its wastewater compliance cheaply while making a modest side profit on the agricultural fertilizer byproducts.
Okay, I have a very clear picture of Proposal 1. It is incredibly lucrative, it boasts a 2.8-year payback, and the engineering is relatively low risk because you are just drying algae and selling it as fertilizer. It seems like an absolute slam dunk for any city planner. So why does the proposal even offer a second option? Why would a city council even look at Proposal 2?
Because Proposal 1 locks the city into the fertilizer market, and commodity fertilizer prices are notoriously volatile, often tied directly to global fossil fuel dynamics. Proposal 2 offers an entirely different strategic avenue. It taps into the massive geopolitically critical market of liquid transportation fuels, specifically third-generation biofuels.
Let's explore that. Welcome to Proposal 2, the higher innovation biodiesel pathway. Walk me through the strategy here. How does it differ from Proposal 1?
The physical foundation of the facility remains exactly the same. The city still builds the 100-ton digester, they still capture the RNG, they still stockpile the cattails, they build the clay-lined ponds, and they use the sensors and the solar kiln. The divergence only happens at the very end of the line, after the algae has been dried into a powder.
Right, so instead of just bagging up that green powder and selling to a local farmer, what does the facility do?
They extract the energy stored inside the cells. Under the right biological stress conditions in the pond, microalgae store excess energy in the form of lipids, which are essentially natural oils or fats. The facility tests the dried algae, and if the lipid content is high enough, and the financial model assumes an average yield of 15% lipids by weight, they route the biomass into an extraction and transesterification infrastructure.
Transesterification. That is a heavy $5 chemistry term. Break that down for me. What actually happens to the algae fat to turn it into fuel?
It is a fascinating chemical process. The extracted algal oil is composed of triglycerides. Imagine a triglyceride molecule as a capital letter E. The vertical backbone of the E is glycerin, and the three horizontal prongs are long, heavy fatty acid chains. Because of that heavy E shape, the oil is thick and very viscous. You can't just pour it into a modern diesel engine. It would gunk up the fuel injectors immediately.
So how do you thin it out?
You introduce an alcohol, typically methanol, along with a catalyst like sodium hydroxide. The methanol chemically attacks the triglyceride molecule and breaks the bonds. It literally snaps off those three horizontal fatty acid chains and attaches itself to them. You are left with three straight independent molecular chains, which are the biodiesel, and the leftover vertical backbone, which just drops out as a glycerin byproduct.
So the chemical reaction literally straightens out the molecules, turning a thick, gooey fat into a thin, combustible liquid that you can pump directly into a city bus.
Exactly. It creates a complete drop-in replacement fuel.
What happens to the actual algae cell material that is left over after you squeeze all the fat out of it?
That is called defatted algae biomass. And even without the lipids, it still contains a massive amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and organocarbon, so it doesn't go to waste. It is still bagged up and sold as a fertilizer or soil amendment, just like in Proposal 1, although its nutrient profile is obviously slightly different.
Okay, let's run the math on the fuel output, because the proposal models this on an assumed annual harvest of 500 dry metric tons of algae from the ponds.
Correct. So if we take 500 dry tons at an assumed 15% lipid content, that yields 75 tons of raw, thick algal oil. The transesterification process we just described isn't perfectly efficient, so assuming a realistic 90% conversion rate, that 75 tons of oil yields 67.5 metric tons of finished, purified biodiesel.
Which translates volumetrically to roughly 20,260 gallons of biodiesel per year. The proposal uses a snapshot retail price of $4.30 per gallon for pure B99 or B100 biodiesel. So 20,260 gallons multiplied by 4.30 gives us a gross fuel value of roughly $87,000 per year before any credits are applied.
Yes. Keep that $87,000 revenue figure in your head as we examine the capital costs for Proposal 2.
And this is where I need to play the role of the skeptical taxpayer again, because the financials here are completely counterintuitive. Let's look at the capital cost. To build Proposal 2, the upfront price tag jumps from $8.46 million to $10.96 million.
That is correct. You have to authorize an additional $2.5 million in upfront capital. That money pays for the industrial lipid extraction equipment, the transesterification chemical reactors, the methanol recovery systems, the explosion-proof fuel storage tanks, and the specialized laboratory equipment required to certify the fuel quality.
Okay, so the city spends $2.5 million more to build it. But what happens to the annual cash flow? In Proposal 1, we were making $2.995 million a year. In Proposal 2, the annual net cash flow drops to $2.945 million. The payback period extends from 2.8 years out to 3.7 years. The total ROI drops from 431% down to 303%.
The math is undisputed. Proposal 2 is more expensive to build, and it yields slightly less annual cash flow.
I have to challenge the logic of this proposal then. Why on earth would any sane city council authorize spending $2.5 million more in taxpayer funds to make $50,000 less per year? Why would you purposely extend your payback period by almost a full year? Based on the spreadsheet, why bother making the biodiesel at all? Why not just sell the algae as fertilizer and take the higher profit?
If a city operates strictly on a short-term static spreadsheet based on today's snapshot prices, you are absolutely right. Proposal 1 wins every single time. But municipal infrastructure is not a static spreadsheet. A wastewater facility is designed to operate for 40 or 50 years. The logic driving Proposal 2 is strategic diversification, resilience, and future-proofing against geopolitical shocks.
Okay, explain that resilience. How does losing $50,000 a year make the city safer?
Because a city is not a corporation whose only goal is maximizing quarterly profit. A city is an operational entity that has to provide services regardless of global market conditions.
Right.
The fertilizer market is deeply intertwined with global natural gas prices and international supply chains. If a city only produces fertilizer, they are locked into that single commodity market. But liquid transportation fuels, specifically diesel, are the absolute lifeblood of municipal operations. Fire trucks, garbage trucks, snowplows, transit buses, emergency backup generators, they all require liquid diesel.
And algae biodiesel represents a highly prized third-generation biofuel.
Exactly. Consider the history of biofuels. First-generation biofuels, like corn ethanol, are highly controversial because they compete directly with human food crops for arable farmland and freshwater. Second-generation biofuels use agricultural waste, like corn stalks or wood chips, which is better, but still tied to the agricultural supply chain. But third-generation biofuels, like algae, are revolutionary. They don't require an inch of arable land, they don't compete with food production, and in this specific facility, they actively clean up toxic municipal wastewater in the process. From a public policy and sustainability perspective, that fuel is incredibly valuable.
So what you're saying is that the city is effectively paying a premium, that extra $2.5 million in capital, to build an internal insurance policy.
Yes. Consider a scenario where the price of fossil diesel spikes to $6, $7, or $8 a gallon due to an international conflict. Or consider a future where heavy carbon taxes are levied against municipal fleets burning fossil fuels. Suddenly, that static spreadsheet changes completely. If the city possesses the internal infrastructure to produce 20,000 gallons of sustainable, carbon-neutral diesel fuel completely independent of the global supply chain, it provides massive operational resilience.
It's a hedge against the future.
Furthermore, we must remember that the $87,000 fuel value we calculated is before any liquid transportation fuel credits are applied. Just as the renewable natural gas relies on RIN credits, liquid biodiesel participates in its own complex web of carbon credit markets, like California's low-carbon fuel standard. If the regulatory environment continues to heavily incentivize low-carbon liquid fuels, that algae biodiesel line item in Proposal 2 could easily dwarf the fertilizer revenue over the next decade. Proposal 2 trades a slightly longer initial payback period for massive, long-term strategic flexibility.
I see the vision. It's about looking decades down the road, not just at the next quarterly budget. But that brings us back to the elephant in the room. We keep dancing around the concept of credits and regulations. Whether the city chooses the fertilizer route in Proposal 1 or the biodiesel route in Proposal 2, the absolute bedrock of the financial model, the thing generating $2 million a year, is the renewable natural gas.
This is the most crucial part of the analysis. We really have to look at the harsh economic realities here. This is where the engineering meets the geopolitics.
The proposal provides a very stark baseline comparison that we need to examine. A lot of cities already have anaerobic digesters, but when they capture the raw biogas, they don't spend millions of dollars on complex upgrading equipment to make pipeline-quality RNG. They use a much simpler system called combined heat and power, or CHP. They just take the raw gas and burn it right there on site in a generator.
Yes. They burn the gas to generate electricity to run the facility's pumps, and they capture the exhaust heat to keep the biological digester tanks warm during the winter. It is a proven, reliable, and incredibly safe way to utilize biogas. The source data provides an economic analysis of a standard CHP system for a facility of this exact size. Over a 15-year period, a CHP system yields a positive net present value of approximately $1,283,149.
So it makes a modest profit, it saves the city on electricity bills, it keeps the tanks warm, and it generates a positive $1 million over 15 years. It is a solid, extremely low-risk municipal investment.
But then you look at the RNG upgrading model proposed by Miller. If the city takes that exact same volume of gas, spends the $5 million to clean it, injects it into the pipeline, and here is the absolute magic condition. If they successfully apply DeFi advanced biofuel RIN credits to that gas, the 15-year net present value skyrockets. It jumps from $1.2 million to over $16.3 million.
It is an order of magnitude difference. It is over 10 times more profitable to clean the gas and sell it with the credits than it is to simply burn it for electricity.
Yeah.
That is why the payback period is 2.8 years. It's a total gold rush. But there's a devastating caveat here, and we need to be crystal clear about the level of risk the city is taking. What happens if the facility cannot secure those RIN credits? What if the paperwork fails, or the local utility refuses the interconnection, or a new administration in the federal government simply changes or cancels the program?
The math is absolutely brutal. Without the artificial value provided by those RIN credits, upgrading biogas to RNG is a financial disaster at this scale. The source data states explicitly that without RINs, the RNG model has a negative net present value of minus $3,185,106 over 15 years.
Negative $3 million, and the payback
It
period.
would take 29 years just to pay back the initial capital.
So if the government policy changes, the 2.8-year gold rush turns into a 29-year albatross around the taxpayers' necks. Relying entirely on government-created RIN credits feels a little bit like building a multi-million-dollar mansion on rented land. You don't own the underlying value. A stroke of a pen in Washington, D.C. could turn a 400% ROI into a massive municipal debt crisis. How does the proposal address that level of systemic political risk?
The proposal does not shy away from it. It actually highlights it as the primary hurdle. It explicitly warns investors and city councils that they should absolutely not proceed to full construction build-out unless fuel qualification, pipeline interconnection, and long-term, legally binding offtake agreements are completely secured.
Right.
You do not pour the concrete until the ink is dry on the RIN contracts. But beyond the contracts, there is a structural financial defense built into the model that mitigates the risk of long-term political shifts.
Wow, the hyper-accelerated payback period.
Exactly. The incredibly short payback periods, roughly 3 years for Proposal 1 and under 4 years for Proposal 2, are not just numbers to make investors happy, they are a defensive shield. By aggressively paying off the entire capital cost of the facility within the first 3 to 4 years, the city heavily protects itself.
I see. If the federal RIN market fluctuates wildly in year 7, or if the program is completely restructured or canceled in year 10, the facility has already recouped its entire construction cost. It is running completely debt-free.
Precisely. Even if the value of the gas drops back down to normal commodity levels later in the facility's life, the city isn't underwater on the mortgage because there is no mortgage. The risk profile dramatically flattens after year 4. Furthermore, we really have to look at the broader global macroeconomic trends driving these policies. Mechanisms like the Renewable Fuel Standard, which creates RINs, exist for a very specific reason: global decarbonization.
Right, because this entire facility is a massive carbon sink.
The source data highlights that advanced closed-loop systems like this one achieve a massive overall greenhouse gas reduction. Specifically, the proposal models a reduction of 11,152 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per ton of dry matter compared to traditional municipal waste handling.
That is over a metric ton of carbon offset for every single ton of waste processed.
It is a profound environmental impact. This facility isn't just a clever waste manager. It is a critical, measurable tool for meeting global climate targets. As long as national and international policies continue to prioritize and mandate carbon reduction, the likelihood of sustained policy support and financial incentives for highly efficient RNG facilities remains incredibly strong. The political risk is real, but the global momentum is entirely in the project's favor.
So we have gone completely down the rabbit hole today. We have taken a deep dive into the absolute granular biological and financial details of the Jory Miller Circular Bioeconomy Investment Proposal. To summarize the staggering journey we've just been on, we are taking everyday toxic municipal sludge and food waste. We are supercharging it in an anaerobic digester by feeding it a mathematically balanced diet of stockpiled solar-dried cattails. We are capturing the resulting methane gas, upgrading it, and navigating complex credit markets to sell it as highly lucrative renewable natural gas. Then, instead of spending millions to neutralize the toxic liquid leftovers, we route them into clay-lined ponds. We use the nitrogen and phosphorus as free fertilizer to grow microalgae and more cattails.
And we don't just blindly grow the algae, we actively manage it. We use real-time submerged sensors to monitor the chlorophyll and turbidity, deploying a mechanical skimmer to harvest only the optimal top layer, drastically reducing the water volume we have to process and preventing bloom crashes. We dry that concentrated biomass in a passive solar kiln, utilizing erythritol phase change materials to dry it overnight, saving thousands of dollars in fossil fuel costs. And finally, the city tests that dried biomass and makes a strategic choice. Do they sell it into the robust agricultural market as a high-profit fertilizer, as in Proposal 1, or do they spend the extra capital to chemically extract the lipids via transesterification, turning the algae into future-proof, sustainable biodiesel for their municipal fleets, as in Proposal 2?
It is a breathtaking piece of engineering, chemistry, and financial design. So what is the ultimate takeaway for you listening to this? Whether you are evaluating municipal infrastructure, sitting on city council, or looking to invest in sustainable biotechnology, the lesson here is profound. Waste is not a physical law of the universe. Waste is simply a failure of imagination.
That is a perfect distillation of the concept. This proposal proves that the math works. If you apply clever biological engineering like realizing that swamp cattails are not nuisance weeds, but vital winter carbon sources, or realizing that the microbes in a cow's stomach can unlock the energy in plant fibers, you can completely rewrite the municipal ledger. If you combine that biology with the clever physics like using the latent heat of melting sugar alcohol in a shipping container to replace $1 million thermal dryer, you can turn an environmental liability into a diversified, multi-million-dollar portfolio of clean energy, sustainable fuels, and agricultural products.
It is deeply inspiring to see engineering solve problems at this scale. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. We have spent this entire time talking about biology, heavy machinery, chemical reactions, and commodity markets. But the proposal hints at one more technological layer that could completely revolutionize how a facility like this operates in the future.
Yes, the integration of AI fertilizer informatics.
Right. We talked about how, in the winter, when the biological ponds are offline, the facility uses magnesium chloride and zeolites to force the nutrients to precipitate into a solid NPK fertilizer called stuvite. Right now, that chemical process is fairly static. You put the chemicals in, you get the standard rocks out. But the proposal notes that artificial intelligence and machine learning can be added to the facility later as a premium product development tool.
If we connect this facility to the broader emerging field of precision agriculture, the implications are just staggering. Imagine a future, perhaps only 5 or 10 years from now, where the anaerobic digestate is not just processed blindly based on historical averages. Imagine an AI control system governing the chemical reactors that is constantly ingesting and analyzing massive real-time data streams. It is receiving live soil health telemetry from automated sensors buried in nearby farms. It is analyzing long-term meteorological forecasts and precipitation models. It is crunching historical crop yield response data for the specific region.
The AI would process all of that external agricultural data, and then it would dynamically alter the chemical precipitation process inside the wastewater plant. It would adjust the exact ratios of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium coming out of the winter recovery unit in real time. It would produce a custom-tailored mineral fertilizer perfectly optimized for the specific chemical needs of the soil in a 50-mile radius for the upcoming spring planting season.
It closes the loop entirely, and it elevates the role of the city. The municipality would no longer just be a waste manager. It wouldn't even just be an energy producer. It would become a highly localized precision agriculture tech hub. It would be taking the exact nutrients the city's population consumed, reformatting them on a molecular level, and returning them to local farms in the exact mathematical ratios required to maximize the next harvest.
It is the ultimate realization of the circular bioeconomy. No waste, no liabilities, just endless, optimized, highly profitable loops of energy and nutrients. It is definitely something to mull over the next time you look at a municipal budget line item for waste disposal and wonder what else could that be. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us. We will catch you next time.